On this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast, we honor the year in music for 1987, along with a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 1987. We also make the case for putting Mariah Carey into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Plus, our Spotlight Hall of Fame isn't a hall, it's the Library of Congress National Recording Registry in Washington, D.C. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. To set the stage for the music of 1987, you have to remember the times. In 1987, the Cold War was still going on between the Soviet Union and the Western world. The breakup of the Soviet Union wouldn't actually start for another couple of years or so. Conservatism in the United States was still in full swing, brought on by the Reagan Revolution led by then-President Ronald Reagan, and also the moral majority conservative movement. The revolution began to fray a bit because of the Iran-Contra scandal in which the Reagan administration went around economic sanctions against the country of Iran, sold weapons to that country in exchange for American hostages that were being held by Iran, then took the money to help train the El Salvador Contra rebel movement. The official John Tower Commission report found that Ronald Reagan ultimately was responsible for the scandal but did not recommend impeachment. Also, at the end of 1987, the stock market crashed. In the music of 1987, hip-hop continued creeping up into the mainstream as LL Cool J, Boogie Down Productions, Eric B. and Rakim, and Public Enemy made noise. Alt-rock also continued to go from college radio to the mainstream, thanks in part to the influence of MTV. Bands like Husker Du, Dinosaur Jr., and Sonic Youth began to break through a little, and if you hung out in your local record store, then you might have heard the rumblings of some bands in Seattle called Soundgarden and the Melvins. The hair band era got jump-started by Bon Jovi, whose second album, Slippery When Wet, became a mega-selling album that year and unleashed a ton of copycat bands. Dance music on the charts was still populated by pop artists like Madonna, along with R&B artists like Michael and Janet Jackson. If you were in Chicago or Detroit, however, then you were probably hitting the underground clubs to listen to two forms of dance music that were going through the club scene but had not quite taken a hold of the mainstream yet: house music and techno music. Bands that formed in 1987 included Alison Krauss and Union Station, Animal Logic, Third Base, 808 State, Danger Danger, Danzig, Diggable Planets, Digital Underground, After 7, DC Talk, Delirium, Bad English, Blues Traveler, Femme Fatale, Fugazi, Bullet Boys, Calloway, The Gin Blossoms, Green Day, Guy, Giant, Inner City, Jagged Edge, The Jungle Brothers, Kid and Play, The Jesus Lizard, Meat Beat Manifesto, Mars, Lunachicks, The Roots, and the little band known then as Nirvana. Bands that called it quit, at least until the inevitable reunions, included the Bay City Rollers, Baltimora, Berlin, the Mary Jane Girls, Modern English, Nena, the Smiths, GTR, General Public, Husker Du, the Violent Femmes, and the aforementioned Mars, who put out one album, had a worldwide Eurodance hit called Pump Up the Volume, and then broke up, all in 1 year. Bands that actually did the reunion thing in 1987 included the Doobie Brothers, Lynyrd Skynyrd, and Prism. MTV Europe started in 1987, as did Kylie Minogue's career when her version of the song The Locomotion became a hit. Whitney Houston became the first female solo artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard Albums chart when her sophomore album Whitney was released. Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue was clinically dead after a heroin overdose, but was revived by paramedics. Elton John had throat surgery that left his voice lower, and the single, or cassette single, made its debut in 1987. The first single to be released was Bryan Adams' song The Heat of the Night. Another big music business event happened on November 18th of that year when CBS Records was bought by Sony for $2 billion. In 1987, U2 released the Joshua Tree album, Michael Jackson released Bad, Prince released Sign of the Times, Pink Floyd released their first album without Roger Waters called A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Also, Def Leppard released Hysteria, and Guns N' Roses released Appetite for Destruction. George Michael's Faith, INXS's biggest-selling album, Kick, and the Dirty Dancing soundtrack all came out late in 1987, with the success of those albums mainly being felt in 1988. The top 10 best-selling albums of 1987, according to Billboard magazine, were Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet, Paul Simon's Graceland, Beastie Boys' License to Ill, Bruce Hornsby and the Ranges' The Way It Is, Janet Jackson's Control, U2's The Joshua Tree, Huey Lewis and the News' 4, Cinderella's Night Songs, Anita Baker's Rapture, and Genesis's Invisible Touch. The top 10 best-selling singles, according to Billboard magazine, were The Bangles' Walk Like an Egyptian, Hearts Alone, Gregory Abbott's Shake You Down, Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody, Starship's Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, Robbie Neville's C'est La Vie, Whitesnake's Here I Go Again, Bruce Hornsby and the Ranges' The Way It Is, Bob Seger's Shakedown from the Beverly Hills Cop soundtrack, and Bon Jovi's Livin' on a Prayer. Musical artists who were born in 1987 included DJ Afrojack, rappers Meek Mill, Kendrick Lamar, Wiz Khalifa, Bow Wow, Justina Valentine, Jay Park, and Dougie Pointer of McFly. Also, Frank Ocean, Aaron Carter, Diana DeGarmo, Kevin Jonas of the Jonas Brothers, Marcus Mumford of Mumford & Sons, Dan Reynolds of Imagine Dragons, Brendan Urie of Panic at the Disco, Kesha, and Jesse McCartney. Musical artists who passed away in 1987 included Paul Butterfield of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, the founder of the New York Blue Note Jazz nightclub, Mr. Alfred Lyon, entertainer extraordinaire, Mr. Liberace himself, guitarist Bola Sete, singer Dean Paul Martin Jr., French singer Dalida, cellist Jacqueline Dupree, bassist Jaco Pastorius, drummer Buddy Rich, Maria Augusta Von Tramp of the Von Tramp family of Sound of Music fame, singer Maxine Sullivan, drummer Carlton Barrett, and guitarist Peter Tosh of Bob Marley and the Wailers, who was murdered in a home invasion in Jamaica. For the Grammys for Music of 1987, U2 won Album of the Year for The Joshua Tree. Paul Simon won Record of the Year for the song Graceland. Somewhere Out There from An American Tale soundtrack won Song of the Year. And Jodie Watley won Best New Artist. At the Eurovision Singing Contest that was held in Brussels, Belgium, Johnny Logan from Ireland won for the song Hold Me Now. At the Tony Awards for that year, Les Miserables won Best Musical and All My Sons won Best Revival of a Musical. The Pulitzer Prize for Music was shared between John Harbison for The Flight into Egypt and Stephen Albert for Flower of the Mountain. At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, record executives Ahmet Ertegun, Jerry Wexler, and Leonard Chess, along with record producers Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, were all inducted into the non-performers category. Louis Jordan, T-Bone Walker, and Hank Williams were inducted into the early influencers category. In the performers category, the hall inducted the Coasters, Eddie Cochran, Bo Diddley, Marvin Gaye, B.B. King, Bill Haley, Roy Orbison, Carl Perkins, Clyde McPhatter, Smokey Robinson, Muddy Waters, Jackie Wilson, Big Joe Turner, Rick Nelson, and this next legend. When you think of great singers whose work has stood the test of time, then Aretha Franklin's name has to be considered at least in the top 10. Rolling Stone magazine named her the greatest singer, male or female, of all time. The Queen of Soul had 77 songs hit the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart, 17 of which went top 10. She was the first female artist to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She won 18 Grammy Awards and sold over 75 million records worldwide. She was also the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, at least 12 honorary college degrees, including more than a few doctorates, and was given both the Grammy Legend Award and the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. And she sang everything from gospel to pop to R&B to even classical music. Aretha started out as a youngster singing gospel in her father, C.L. Franklin's church in Detroit, Michigan. Her father was a minister who became a bit of a celebrity in the Detroit area for his energetic sermons. Because of this, as a child, Aretha knew people such as gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who sometimes babysat her, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who she sang for before some of his rallies. Her childhood, despite knowing a lot of celebrities, was not an easy one. Her mom and dad divorced when she was 6 due to her father's alleged affairs. Her mom died when Aretha was 10, and by the time Aretha was 14, she had 2 children. When Aretha turned 18, she decided to switch from singing gospel to R&B, following in her friend Sam Cooke's footsteps. She first recorded with Columbia Records. In those 6 years, she only found mid-level success at best. In 1967, she went to Atlantic Records. It was there where Aretha made her mark. Her first album at Atlantic, released on March 10th, was I Never Loved a Man the Way That I Love You. That album had the hits I Never Loved a Man the Way That I Love You, Do Right Man, Do Right Woman, Baby, 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 and her signature song, Respect. The irony of singing this song about empowerment was that at the same time, Aretha was in an abusive marriage with her manager, Ted White, whom she finally divorced a couple years later. Aretha wanted to record with the famed Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section at Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. She got to the studio and recorded the song I Never Loved a Man. Her recording session only lasted 1 day as her husband/manager got into a fistfight with Muscle Shoals owner Rick Hall on the first day of recording. She left the very next day. Still, the vocals for the song were finished on the first day, so they were put onto the song. Her signature song, Respect, was originally recorded by Otis Redding. Aretha and producer Jerry Wexler added the sax solo in the middle, and the Sock It To Me line was added by Aretha and her sister Carolyn. The album itself went to number 1 on Billboard's R&B chart and number 2 on the pop chart. The single Respect was number 1 on the pop chart, while the single I Never Loved a Man peaked at number 9. When it first came out, it was given decent reviews, except that some reviewers thought the musicians on the album could have played better. Time changes everything, of course, because this album set the stage for Aretha's rise, with her next couple of albums cementing her legacy. Her next album, Aretha Arrives, arrived only 5 months after her Atlantic debut album and had the hit Baby I Love You. Columbia Records, her former label, tried to capitalize on Aretha's newfound success by releasing a compilation album, Take a Look, only a month after the album Aretha Arrives. Unless you're a huge fan of Aretha's and needs every single thing she's ever put out, you could probably skip that one. The album Lady Soul was her third album released by Atlantic in less than 1 year. Aretha started recording the album on February 16, 1967 at Atlantic Studios in New York City. Legendary producer Jerry Wexler was at the producing helm for this album. Aretha had some star power to help her out on this album. Among the star power were Eric Clapton and Bobby Womack, and singing backup vocals were Aretha's sister, along with gospel singer and mother of Whitney Houston, Cissy Houston. The big singles off this album were You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, which was written by Carole King, Chain of Fools, and Since You've Been Gone. The album was released on January 22, 1968, and went to number 2 on the Billboard Albums chart. Lady Soul is considered one of the greatest albums of all time on a lot of different best-of lists. Her next albums, Aretha Now and Aretha in Paris, kept her on a roll with hits like Rocksteady and Daydreaming. Then she started hitting some speed bumps with a bunch of her albums towards the end of the 1970s. And at the end of 1979, Aretha and Atlantic Records parted ways, ending that era. In 1980, Aretha signed with legendary record label head Clive Davis's label, Arista Records. Her first act with the new label was to film her part in the Blues Brothers movie. Her 1980 album Aretha Did Okay and yielded the hits United Together and her version of Otis Redding's song I Can't Turn You Loose. Her follow-up, Love All the Hurt Away, did well, becoming her first gold record in years. Her 1982 album Jump to It did even better, with the song Jump to It becoming a big hit. 1985's album Who's Zoomin' Who was her breakout album in the Arista era. Aretha by now had switched her sound to a more pop sound. It worked like a charm with big hits Freeway of Love with the saxophone of Clarence Clemons of Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. She also had the big hits Who's Zoomin' Who and her worldwide hit duet with George Michael, I Knew You Were Waiting for Me. Who's Zoomin' Who was the zenith of Aretha's post-Atlantic career, going platinum. In 1987, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. After that, while she did albums that were mid-level in terms of sales, she settled into legend status, doing tours and special performances. There was, for instance, the 1988 Grammy Awards, where she filled in for Luciano Pavarotti, who was ill the night of the ceremony. The ceremony producers asked Aretha to step in and perform the aria Nessun Dorma, which she had performed with Pavarotti only a couple of nights before at a charity function. Aretha rehearsed with the orchestra for a little while, figured she could sing it in the key that the orchestra already knew it in, then delivered a performance of the ages that night that is still talked about to this day. It also garnered an extremely long standing ovation from the Grammy audience. Who knew that Aretha could sing opera? As the new century rolled on, Aretha continued touring, but her health concerns began to take their toll. She ended up canceling shows and shortening tours. Her final full concert was held on September 3rd, 2017, although she did give one more performance for Elton John's AIDS charity concert on November 7th, 2017. Aretha announced performance dates for 2018, but the dates were postponed, never to be fulfilled. On August 16th, 2018, on the same day in history that the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, passed away in 1977, the world lost the Queen of Soul at the age of 76. Presented for induction by Keith Richards of the 1989 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, the Rolling Stones, the Queen of Soul, Miss Aretha Franklin, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, class of 1987. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast. Every day we tell you what happened on that date in music history, along with music releases, birthdays, and passings. So, if you like this podcast and want more music history, then please search the Music History Today podcast in audio or video form on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. In the era of greatest female pop, dance, R&B artists of the 80s and 90s, there are Madonna, Janet Jackson, Whitney Houston, and Mariah Carey. Now, before you go screaming about why no Britney, Christina, etc., this is a Hall of Fame discussion, and none of the acts from the boy band era are eligible just yet. In fact, Britney won't actually be eligible until 2024. In any event, out of the 4 ladies who are eligible, 3 of them are now in: Madonna, Whitney, and Janet. Today, I'm going to make the case for Mariah to be inducted. Mariah Carey held the record for the longest stretch at number 1 on the Billboard singles chart with Boyz II Men with the song One Sweet Day until Old Town Road from Lil Nas X came along. She is Columbia Records' biggest selling artist of all time. While Madonna, Whitney, and Janet owned the 1980s and early 90s, Mariah owned most of the 90s into the early part of the millennium. She is the biggest selling female artist worldwide of the last century and the biggest selling artist worldwide regardless of genre of the 1990s. She's won 5 Grammy Awards and was ranked number 2 on VH1's Greatest Women in Music list. Her biggest legacy and influence, for better or worse perhaps, are her vocal skills. She has a 5-octave range and can hit notes that only dogs can hear. As such, nearly every singer now thinks that they can sing like her, and unfortunately they all try. A lot of them not only can't sing like her, they ruin their voices trying. But that goes to show you just how unique a voice Mariah Carey has. Now, if you want to get your feet wet with her, then I would go with the essential Mariah Carey. If you want a deep dive, then you can't go wrong with her debut album. Dreams is also a good one, as is Emotions and Music Box. Plus, her Christmas album is one of the few that is actually worth owning. No offense to anybody else with a Christmas album out there. In any event, for being one of the biggest selling artists of all time, as well as her influence on singers of Gen Z and millennials alone, Mariah Carey definitely deserves to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Usually, we highlight a different musical Hall of Fame since there's a bunch more than just the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Blues Hall, the Grammy Museum, among many, many others. But this time, we're going to talk about one that isn't a hall per se. However, to me, it's probably the most important. The Library of Congress for the United States, aside from being a place in the movie All the President's Men, is the nation's library. Established in April of 1800, it has more than 38 million books, 14 million photographs, 70 million manuscripts, and 5.5 million maps. From a musical standpoint, it's important for a couple of reasons. The first is that it has over 8 million pieces of sheet music and over 3.5 million recordings. The second and more important reason is what it does with certain recordings. Since the passage of the National Recording Preservation Act of 2000, the library has developed a registry to preserve and protect certain pieces of music and other recordings that are considered historically relevant. That's a pretty high honor, knowing that your song or album is so important to the nation that it needs to be preserved forever. That's a pretty high-class list you're joining here. Some of these recordings are actually speeches or radio shows from yesteryear. For instance, the earliest recorded version of Abbott and Costello's classic Who's on First comedy sketch, along with Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech are all in the registry, as are the first recordings on cylinders that Thomas Edison used to show off the phonograph at an exhibition. The first official class was in 2002. There were 50 recordings that were declared important. All of the above-mentioned recordings were in that first class. Prince Rogers Nelson was born on June 7, 1958, and was the product of musical parents. Prince's nickname was Skipper throughout childhood because he hated the name Prince. Prince also suffered from epilepsy when he was younger and often had seizures. The disease didn't stop Prince from becoming involved in sports, however, including playing basketball. He also studied ballet, which definitely helped with his dancing skills in his videos and on stage. Prince's parents divorced when he was 10, and the rest of his childhood was spent bouncing back and forth between parents and new step-parents, much like children of divorce do. Prince also found himself gravitating towards music, having written his first song when he was 7 years old. He was rumored to have learned to play at least 10 instruments pretty well by the time he hit his 20s. By the time he was 19, Prince was signed to a managerial contract, and based on the strength of his demo tape, Prince signed with Warner Brothers Records and released his first album, For You, on April 7th, 1978. Just 2 months shy of his 20th birthday. A little over a year later, Prince released his second album, which was self-titled, which had the hit I Want to Be Your Lover and also the hit Why You Want to Treat Me So Bad. In 1980, he released the album Dirty Mind, which got him into some trouble with songs like Head. It also got him an opening act slot on Rick James's tour. 1981's controversy spawned the hit of the same name. Around this time, Prince started forming side projects like the band The Time. Prince's double album, 1999, was released in 1982 and had the top 10 hits 1999, Little Red Corvette, and Delirious. Little Red Corvette was also helped by the fact that it was only one of 2 songs from black artists that MTV was playing in heavy rotation when the music video came out, the other video being Michael Jackson's classic Billie Jean. Still, 5 albums in 5 years was only the beginning. Prince was about to become a superstar only 2 years later. After his 1999 album, Prince decided that he wanted to make a movie that was loosely based on his life. It was called Purple Rain. This album was the second album to also credit his band The Revolution, as they did help write some of the songs. Certain songs have a bit of a history. Let's Go Crazy is probably the best crafted song about moral ethics ever to be made. The line towards the end of the song about how pills, thrills, and daffodils will kill is now kind of ironic considering how Prince passed away. The famous drum machine intro after the organs in the beginning is Prince's go-to drum machine, the Linn LM1. Take Me With You was supposed to be a song for his side project Apollonia 6, but instead found its way onto the soundtrack. Contrary to popular belief, by the way, the female voice on the song is not Apollonia, and it is not Lisa or Wendy from The Revolution. It's actually singer Jill Jones. Computer Blue was originally a 14-minute song, but that got cut back. I'm sure the original version turned up in a special edition of the soundtrack somewhere. Prince played all of the instruments on the songs The Beautiful Ones and Darling Nikki, along with the song When Doves Cry. For Doves, he was trying to go with a different sound, so he pulled the bass line out of the song. By the way, as an aside, if you were wondering why there are parental advisory stickers put on certain records, you kind of have this album and Prince to thank for that. See, there was a girl around that time who was listening to the song Darling Nikki, which has some controversial lyrics to be nice about it. Her mother was the wife of a senator. Her mother was Tipper Gore. Her husband was Senator Al Gore. You may have heard of him if you're old enough. He was also not only father of the internet, quote unquote, but he was also United States Vice President. But before that, he was a senator. And since his wife Tipper got so upset about the lyrics to Darling Nikki, along with certain other songs that were out around that time, she got him to do a congressional hearing on the matter, which led to parental advisory stickers being put on albums so that parents would know when their kids are listening to dirty lyrics. Of course, now you ignore all those stickers anyway because it doesn't matter anymore, I guess. Welcome to the 1980s. That is the reason why. And now you know. And knowing is half the battle. In any event, back to this. The songs I Would Die For You, Baby I'm a Star, and Purple Rain were all actually recorded a year before at a benefit concert for the Minnesota Dance Theater on August 3rd, 1983 at the now famous First Avenue Club that was in the movie. Prince debuted those three songs, as well as his new guitarist at the time, Wendy Melvoin. The title track for the album has its own history. According to the Revolution's keyboardist, Dr. Fink, Prince wanted to write a song that sounded almost like it could have come from Bob Seger. The band Journey, however, tells a slightly different story. According to them, Prince called them up one day and mentioned that he had written a song that sounded a lot like their hit song, Faithfully. He wanted their blessing so that, of course, they wouldn't sue him. Not only did they give him their blessing once they heard the song, but they thanked him for asking them, since a lot of other bands had ripped off their sound without even asking first. And if you actually listen to both the songs Purple Rain and Faithfully back to back, you can actually hear the similarities between the two songs, especially in the chord progression. Purple Rain, the album, came out on June 25th, 1984 and spent 32 weeks on the Billboard Albums Chart's top 10, taking the number one spot for 24 weeks. Purple Rain made rumpled pirate shirts not only a fashion trend, but also the basis for a famous Seinfeld episode. It also gave Prince a lot of awards, including Grammys, a Golden Globe, and an Academy Award for Best Music Score. It is also considered a classic album and one of the greatest albums ever made. Prince and the Revolution's 1984 smash hit soundtrack to the film Purple Rain, inducted into the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry in Washington, D.C. in 2011. And that is it for this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast. For more podcast episodes, which drop every Thursday in audio and video form, then please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from.